The first light of dawn spread over the Texas plains, a soft amber glow brushing against miles of dry mesquite and red dust. The cattle ranches woke with the same rhythm they always had, boots crunching over gravel, roosters calling from the distance, and the faint hum of a train far beyond the hills. But that morning the whistle sounded different. It was sharper, longer, carrying with it the uneasy promise of strangers. Eli McGraw lifted his hat against the rising sun. He'd been up since before dawn as usual, but today his chores felt heavier. The war overseas had taken his younger brother, Tom, and left behind only silence in the house and a hollow echo in Eli's chest. The telegram still lay folded on the mantel, edges curled from the dry air. He didn't need to read it anymore to remember the words. He walked toward the corral, kicking at the dust, when the rumble came. Engines rolling over the dirt road, a convoy of army trucks headed toward the newly fenced field south of town. The soldiers at the front waved to a small group of townsfolk gathered near the road. The gossip had been circling for weeks. German prisoners were coming to Texas. Most folks didn't believe it until now. Eli stopped by the fence post, squinting through the sun's glare. "Prisoners of war," he muttered under his breath. "Hell of a thing to bring to cattle country." Old Sheriff Dillard, standing nearby, spit tobacco into the dust. "Government says they'll help with farm work." "Cheaper than hiring men." Eli didn't answer. His jaw clenched and his hand gripped the post tighter. The thought of Germans, men like the ones who'd killed his brother, working the same soil, felt like a betrayal. The truck slowed near the gate, soldiers barking orders as they jumped down. Through the slats, Eli caught glimpses of faces, young, sunburned, weary. None looked like monsters. That unsettled him most of all. The air was dry, thick with dust stirred by the tires. A tumbleweed rolled lazily across the road before being crushed under a wheel. The scent of diesel mixed with sweat and cowhide. Somewhere, a hawk circled above, indifferent to the history unfolding below. One of the soldiers shouted, "They'll be settled by evening." "Don't you worry, folks." But the townspeople didn't look convinced. Mrs. Carter, who ran the general store, whispered, "What if they try to escape?" The sheriff chuckled without humor. "Ain't nowhere to go. Closest town's 30 miles, and all of it hotter than sin." Eli turned away. The day wasn't getting any shorter, and the herd still needed tending. Yet as he walked back toward the barn, the sound of German voices drifted over the wind, steady, unfamiliar, human. He tried to shut them out, but curiosity lingered, crawling under his skin like a stubborn splinter. That night, as the sun melted into the horizon, Eli sat by his porch with a tin cup of coffee. The wind carried the faint echo of laughter from the distant camp. He told himself it didn't matter, but something about that sound, a laugh so ordinary, cut through his bitterness. And if you've ever wondered how enemies could sit side by side and share more than just the silence of war, stay with me. Before we ride deeper into this story of loss, mercy, and the fires that change men, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning. The following morning, the sun climbed higher and hotter than usual, baking the plains until the horizon shimmered like glass. Dust hung in the air, refusing to settle. From the direction of the railway came the low groan of engines, followed by the rhythmic clatter of boots, American and German alike. Fort Stockton was no longer just cattle country. It was now home to men who once fought on opposite sides of the ocean. Eli McGraw stood near the pasture fence, a coil of rope hanging from his shoulder. The convoy rolled past him toward the fenced compound the army had built a few miles out. Soldiers with rifles sat in the back of the trucks, faces hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. Behind them, rows of men in faded uniforms stared quietly at the open Texas sky. They didn't look dangerous. That thought irritated Eli. He'd expected to see cold killers, not weary men with hollow cheeks and sunburned skin. They looked more lost than threatening. "Never thought I'd see Krauts in my own county," Hank Dusty Malone muttered beside him. Dusty was lean, red-faced, and always quick with a word. "Guess we're running out of working hands. War took all the young ones." Eli kept his eyes fixed on the trucks. "Doesn't mean we need theirs," he replied flatly. Dusty shrugged. "Government says they'll earn their keep. Beats letting the crops rot." When the last truck stopped, a soldier barked an order in English, then repeated it in German. The prisoners stepped out, forming a line under the sun. Most were young, barely 20, Eli guessed. One of them, taller than the rest, had sandy hair and a sharp, thoughtful face. He stood straight despite the heat, eyes calm and searching. Eli noticed him before he could stop himself. "That one," Dusty said, nodding. "Looks like he could fix a tractor with his bare hands." Eli grunted. "Or tear it apart." The officer in charge, Captain Harris, approached the townsfolk. "These men will be working under supervision," he said, his tone clipped. "They'll help with repairs, fieldwork and maintenance. You'll treat them fairly and they'll be guarded at all times. Any issues, report to the camp." Someone from the crowd asked, "Ain't they dangerous?" The captain's jaw tightened. "They're soldiers, not savages, and they're unarmed." Eli said nothing. His gaze wandered back to the tall German. Their eyes met briefly, steady, unreadable. It was over in a second, but something about that look unsettled him. Later, as the crowd dispersed, the prisoners were marched toward the compound, a chain of khaki and grey weaving through the golden field. The sound of boots and gravel echoed long after they passed. Eli stayed behind, leaning against the fence post, his hands rough from rope and sun. He didn't realize Dusty was still there until the man spoke. "You think they're just like us?" Eli shook his head slowly. "I think they're men who lost their way." Dusty gave a half smile. "Ain't we all, partner?" The wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of German voices toward them, soft, melodic, foreign. Eli turned toward the horizon, where the compound shimmered in the heat. Something in his chest stirred, something he didn't want to name. The strangers had arrived, and though Eli didn't know it yet, they'd change far more than the land they worked. The Texas sun burned high over the plains, turning the air into a trembling haze. The days had settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and familiar, boots crunching over dry dirt, the creak of wooden gates, and the hum of distant chatter from the POW camp. Life moved forward, though it carried a new and uneasy balance. Eli McGraw spent most mornings near the southern fence line, where he delivered feed and lumber for the camp's construction. The Army had asked local ranchers to help with supply runs, promising fair payment. Eli hadn't wanted the job, but money spoke louder than pride, and the ranch was bleeding from the drought. He rarely looked at the prisoners directly, though their presence filled the edges of every day. They worked quietly, organized and precise, under the sharp eye of armed guards. Most kept their heads low, but every now and then Eli caught a glimpse of the tall German, the one he'd noticed during their arrival. His name, he'd overheard, was Lucas Schneider. He carried himself differently from the others, not with arrogance but with a quiet steadiness, as if discipline were the only thing left to hold on to. By late afternoon, the heat grew thick enough to melt patience itself. Eli crouched by the fence, unscrewing the top of his dented thermos, hoping for a swallow of lukewarm coffee. The lid slipped from his fingers and fell into the dust, rolling toward the prisoner's line. He cursed under his breath, too tired to chase it. Before he could move, a figure broke from the group. Lucas bent down, picked up the lid, brushed the dirt from it, and approached the fence. A guard raised his rifle slightly, but Lucas stopped just short, extending the lid through the wire. Eli hesitated, the moment dragging long enough for the sound of cicadas to fill the silence. Finally, he stepped forward and took it. "Thank you," he muttered, almost against his will. Lucas nodded once. "You're welcome," he replied, his English clear but marked by a heavy accent. Then he turned and walked back to the line. Eli watched him go, his brow furrowed. The exchange had lasted no more than 10 seconds, but it left him oddly unsettled. He wasn't used to politeness from men in grey uniforms. As the sun dropped lower, the workday ended. Soldiers gathered their rifles, prisoners lined up, and dust swirled like smoke in the fading light. Eli poured the last of his coffee into the lid Lucas had touched. He stared at it for a long while before drinking, unsure why it tasted different, stronger somehow. That night, the ranch felt emptier than usual. The cicadas had quieted, and the stars stretched endlessly above him. Eli sat on the porch, the old thermos resting on his knee. He thought of Tom, his brother's laugh, his letters, the pride he carried when he left for Europe. Then he thought of Lucas, standing under the same sky, thousands of miles from home, serving a cause he might not have chosen. Eli set the thermos down beside him. The coffee had gone cold, but its scent lingered. He couldn't explain why, but he felt something shifting, small, uncertain, like the wind before a storm. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, and Eli found himself listening, wondering if the enemy could ever sound so human. The storm rolled in without warning, dark clouds swallowing the Texas sky as the wind began to twist through the mesquite trees. Eli McGraw had spent the day hauling feed near the edge of the camp, working with a few ranch hands and a squad of soldiers. When the first drops of rain hit, thick and heavy as coins, they hurried toward the barn for shelter. But the barn roof leaked like a sieve, and the storm refused to ease. A guard shouted over the thunder, "We'll stay put until it passes. Keep everyone together." The POWs, about a dozen of them, were herded toward the covered space near the ranch house, their uniforms darkened by rain. Eli wasn't happy about it, but there was no use fighting nature. He grabbed a tin bucket and set it under the worst of the leaks, shaking his head. "Texas rain waits till the driest day to show up," he muttered. Lucas Schneider, among the prisoners, gave a faint smile. "It's the same in Hamburg," he said, his voice calm but tired. "When it rains, it never stops." Eli glanced at him, half surprised to hear his voice again. "Didn't figure you'd compare Texas to Germany." "Only the sky," Lucas replied quietly. "It looks the same when it's angry." The storm deepened, thunder shaking the walls. One of the guards, a young man barely 20, tried to start a small fire in the iron barrel near the doorway. The wood was damp, sputtering, smoke curling low before catching flame. Soon the smell of burning cedar filled the air, and the men, Texans and Germans alike, gathered around it. Someone passed a dented coffee pot toward the heat. The liquid that poured out was bitter, almost black, but it was warmth, and that was enough. Eli poured himself a cup, then, after a moment of hesitation, handed the pot toward Lucas. The German nodded his thanks before taking a sip. Dusty Malone, shaking rain from his hat, leaned back against a wall. "Guess war don't stop the need for coffee," he joked, earning a few chuckles from both sides. The laughter was awkward but real. Then Dusty, always the storyteller, leaned forward, eyes glinting in the firelight. "Y'all ever hear about the night I got lost riding cattle through the Pecos storm? Swore the lightning struck so close I could taste the metal in my teeth." Eli rolled his eyes, but the Germans listened, their faces intent, their English just good enough to follow. Dusty's hands danced as he spoke, his voice painting thunder and wind like old friends. When he finished, a ripple of low laughter spread around the circle. Then, to everyone's surprise, Lucas spoke. "In my town, we told stories too, about the sea taking what it wanted, and fishermen learning to live with loss." His tone was calm, the rhythm of his accent carrying a quiet poetry. Even those who didn't catch every word felt its weight. Eli studied him through the firelight, the man who should have been his enemy, telling stories of home just as any cowboy might. The storm outside still raged, but something softer had settled among them, a silence filled not with fear but with understanding. As the rain eased and the fire dimmed, Eli realized he was listening more than judging. Somewhere between the thunder and the laughter, a bridge had begun to form, fragile but real. The morning after the storm smelled of wet cedar and smoke. The clouds were gone, but puddles shimmered across the ranch yard, turning the dust to clay. Eli McGraw stood near the corral, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The night before still lingered in his mind, the fire, the laughter, the strange ease that had slipped between enemies like a truce neither side had spoken aloud. He found himself watching the POW group again as they were brought to the ranch to finish repairs. The soldiers moved among them, relaxed now, rifles still ready but not so tightly gripped. Lucas Schneider carried a wooden beam over his shoulder with two others, his expression steady as always. Eli tried to look away but didn't. When the brake whistle blew, Dusty Malone passed around a dented coffee pot. "Don't say I never share with our new farmhands," he joked. The guards didn't protest. so one of the prisoners, Lucas again, accepted the pot and poured for his men before handing it back. His movements were slow, deliberate, respectful. Eli took his tin cup, nodding. "You ever miss home?" he asked, the words surprising even himself. Lucas looked up, eyes pale as the washed-out sky. "Every day," he said simply. "But I miss peace more." Dusty whistled low. "Can't argue that." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It felt honest, almost human. Someone from the group began humming quietly, a tune Eli didn't recognize but found oddly soothing. It drifted through the air like something old and sad, yet steady as the turning of a windmill. "Your brother," Lucas said softly, breaking the quiet. "He fought in Europe, yes?" Eli froze. "Yeah," he answered after a moment. "Didn't make it back." Lucas nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. My own brother was lost in the East. I don't know where he rests." Their words hung between them like smoke. Two men who'd grown up under different flags, standing on the same red earth, both haunted by faces they'd never see again. Dusty cleared his throat, eager to lighten the air. "Well, hell, maybe that's why we're all still breathing, to remember 'em proper." He gave a crooked grin, and even Eli managed a faint smile. The men went back to work, but something subtle had shifted. The rhythm of shovels and hammers blended with low talk, even laughter at times. The guards didn't stop it. They'd seen worse ways to spend a day. Later, as the sun dipped low, Eli rested near the barn, his back against the wall. Lucas approached, hesitant but steady. "You told stories last night," he said, "about your cattle, your river floods. You speak like my father did." Eli tilted his head. "You mean I complain too much?" Lucas smiled faintly. "No, you speak like a man who listens to the land." Eli wasn't sure what to say to that. He handed Lucas his cup of coffee instead. "Then you'll fit in fine here, long as you listen back." Lucas accepted the cup, sipping carefully. The sky blazed orange above them, shadows stretching long and thin. For the first time since the war had touched his life, Eli felt a strange peace settle in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. And as the evening wind carried the last notes of that German song across the fields, Eli realized that words, shared quietly across a fire, could rebuild more than fences. The weeks that followed slipped into a quiet rhythm. The POW camp's boundaries expanded, and the soldiers worked side by side with the ranchers under the hard Texas sun. Dust caked the men's boots, sweat streaked their shirts, and for the first time since their arrival, laughter began to echo faintly through the long afternoons. Eli McGraw watched Lucas Schneider closely. The German worked with a focus that seemed almost meditative, hands steady, movements precise. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice carried the same patience that guided his work. He could fix almost anything: fences, gates, even the temperamental ranch truck that hadn't started in months. One morning, as Eli wrestled with a broken water pipe near the cattle trough, Lucas knelt beside him without a word. "You'll strip the thread that way," Lucas said, calm but firm. Eli shot him a glare. "I've been fixing pipes since before you could shave." Lucas smiled slightly. "Then you've had more time to do it wrong." Eli almost barked a reply, but stopped. Lucas tightened the coupling just once, perfectly, and water began to flow again, clean and cold. Dusty Malone, sitting on the fence nearby, laughed loud enough to startle the horses. "Looks like the Germans got you beat, Eli." Eli scowled, but couldn't hide his grudging respect. "Guess even a busted clock's right twice a day." Lucas only nodded, that faint smile still tugging at his lips. "Then I hope to be right 3 times. The work continued like that, simple, hard, and strangely healing. The POWs rebuilt fences torn by last month's storm, stacked hay bales, and dug trenches for irrigation. Their efficiency impressed the locals, though many still eyed them with suspicion from a distance. But Eli had started to see them differently. They weren't soldiers here. They were just men trying to stay alive, one task at a time. In town, whispers spread that the prisoners were being treated too kindly. Eli heard them at the feed store, sharp as barbed wire. "You give a man comfort, he'll forget he's an enemy," one rancher said. Eli said nothing. He simply paid for his supplies and left, jaw tight. Back at the ranch, Lucas was fixing the old windmill that hadn't turned in years. The blades were warped, the shaft rusted solid. "You think it's worth saving?" Eli asked, arms crossed. Lucas looked up, sunlight glinting off the sweat on his forehead. "Everything built by hand can be rebuilt by hand." Eli hesitated. "You sound like my father." "Then he was a wise man," Lucas said. Eli turned away, pretending to inspect the cattle, but his throat felt tight. He'd never expected to find comfort in the words of a man who should have been his enemy. By dusk, the windmill creaked, groaned, and finally began to spin. Slow at first, then steady, pulling water up from the deep well below. The sound was like breath returning to a body long still. Dusty slapped Eli's shoulder. "Well, I'll be damned. Maybe there's something to this peace through labor thing." Eli just nodded, eyes fixed on the spinning blades. "Work of hands," he murmured. "Guess it builds more than fences." And as the first stars blinked over the Texas sky, he realized that somewhere between labor and loss, a fragile respect had begun to take root. The Texas summer pressed down hard, the kind of heat that made men move slower and think deeper. The days had stretched long, filled with dust, sweat, and the steady rhythm of work. But that afternoon, something different hung in the air, a quiet unease that even the wind refused to touch. Eli McGraw returned from town with his pockets lighter and his spirit heavier. A letter had arrived from the army. He'd known it might come, yet when the postmaster handed it over, the sight of that official seal still felt like a punch to the chest. He hadn't opened it on the ride home. He didn't need to. Letters like that only carried one kind of message. He sat on the porch, the paper trembling slightly in his rough hands. Dusty approached, chewing on a piece of straw, eyes full of sympathy he didn't know how to show. "You gonna read it?" he asked softly. Eli tore the envelope open without answering. The words blurred as he read. Private Thomas McGraw, confirmed deceased in action near Saint-Lô, France. His jaw tightened. He'd already buried his brother in his mind months ago, but seeing it written made the loss solid, final. Dusty mumbled something about giving him space and walked off toward the barn. Eli stayed where he was, the letter resting on his knee. For a long time he just listened, to the faint creak of the windmill turning, to the distant hum of men working in the field, to the world that dared to keep moving while his had stopped. Late that day, Lucas Schneider arrived with a work detail. They were repairing a broken fence near the back pasture. Eli didn't speak to him at first, didn't trust his own voice. But Lucas noticed the folded paper sticking out of Eli's pocket, stained from his sweat. "Bad news?" Lucas asked quietly. Eli glanced at him, eyes hard. "You could say that." Lucas hesitated, then nodded once. "I received a letter once," he said. "From Hamburg. It said my home no longer exists. My mother, my sister, and gone." His voice didn't waver, but something in it cracked. Eli looked away, his throat tight. War sure has a way of taking everything that matters. Lucas crouched by the fence post, his hands steady as he worked. "Yes, it takes, but it also shows what can't be destroyed." Eli frowned. "And what's that supposed to be?" "The part of a man that still chooses to build," Lucas replied. "Even when everything he built is gone." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. For the first time, Eli felt the edge of his anger dull, replaced by something quieter, recognition. As the sun dipped behind the hills, they finished the repairs in near silence. Lucas handed Eli a small wooden peg, carved roughly into the shape of a bird. "For your brother," he said simply. Eli took it without a word. The weight of the carving was light, but it settled deep inside him. He slipped it into his pocket beside the letter, the two pieces of paper and wood pressing together, loss and memory side by side. That night, Eli didn't light a lamp. He just sat under the stars, coffee cooling beside him, wind rustling the dry grass. Somewhere nearby, a coyote called, and for once the sound didn't feel lonely. Word travels fast in small towns, and Fort Stockton was no exception. Within days, Talk about the German prisoners spread from the feed store to the church steps, carried on whispers sharp enough to cut. Some folks claimed Eli McGraw had grown soft, that he was treating the POWs like neighbors instead of enemies. Others said he was forgetting what side he was on. Eli heard it first at the general store. He'd come to buy nails and salt blocks, but the room went quiet the moment he stepped through the door. Old Mr. Harlan, who ran the counter, cleared his throat and said, "Heard you been letting them Germans work your land." Eli met his gaze. "They work. I supervise." Nothing more. "Still," Harlan said, voice tight, "seems strange. My boy's fighting in France right now, and you're breaking bread with the same kind he's dying to stop." Eli's jaw tensed. "I buried my brother for the same war, Harlan. Don't tell me I forgot which side I'm on." A few men shifted awkwardly, but one of them, young and loud, spoke up. "You're making folks uneasy, Eli. Letting the enemy touch your tools, walk your fields. Next thing you'll be teaching them English." Eli set his payment on the counter, voice low and steady. "Maybe you ought to see the men before you judge them. They're prisoners, not monsters." The young man sneered. "That's what they want you to think." Eli turned and walked out before his temper got the better of him. Outside, the sun hit him like a furnace, the heat doing little to burn off the sting of their words. Later that day, Dusty Malone found him by the windmill, tightening a bolt that didn't need tightening. "Heard what went down in town," Dusty said carefully. "You all right?" Eli shrugged. "They don't understand." Dusty kicked at the dirt. "Maybe not. But folks don't like things that blur the lines. Black and white's easier than grey." Eli looked out toward the fields, where Lucas and the others were stacking hay under the guard's watchful eye. Their movements were efficient, almost graceful in their precision. "War paints everything in grey," Eli muttered. Dusty sighed. "You always were too stubborn to hate easy." Eli gave a small, humorless laugh. "Guess that's my curse." As the evening fell, the tension from town seemed to hang in the air. When Lucas brought the tools back to the shed, Eli noticed the quiet between them had changed, heavier now, as if the whispers had reached even across the language barrier. "They talk," Lucas said softly. "They always do," Eli replied. "Doesn't mean they're right." Lucas nodded, setting the tools down. "In my country, words can wound more than bullets." Eli glanced at him, surprised. "Seems some things don't change with borders." They stood in silence as the wind picked up, rattling the tin roof. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang for evening service. Eli thought of how easy it was for good people to be blinded by fear, how war turned truth into something twisted. When Lucas walked back toward the camp, Eli stayed behind, staring at the windmill turning slow against the fading light. He knew the storm brewing in town wasn't done yet, and this time it wasn't one he could hide from. By early September, the land had dried again, cracked and hard beneath the Texas sun. The repaired windmill rose above the ranch like a sentinel, its blades still and waiting. The army had assigned the POWs to help restore the property's irrigation system, and for weeks, the work had gone on without rest. The well beneath the windmill was deep, but the gears had seized years ago. Eli McGraw had given up on fixing it long before the Germans arrived. Now Lucas Schneider stood at its base, tools laid out neatly on a cloth. His sleeves were rolled up, his face streaked with oil and dust. "This mechanism," he said, tapping the rusted gear, "it needs patience, not force." Eli crouched beside him, hands on his knees. "Patience don't come easy around here," he muttered. Lucas smiled faintly. "Then today is a good day to learn." For hours the two men worked in silence, interrupted only by the whir of cicadas and the occasional clang of metal. Dusty Malone watched from a few yards away, shaking his head in amusement. "Never thought I'd see the day a Texas cowboy takes orders from a German mechanic." Eli wiped his brow. "I ain't taking orders. I'm learning what I already knew." "Which is?" Dusty grinned. "That I hate fixing windmills." Even Lucas laughed at that, the sound carrying light across the dry air. It was a simple moment, but it softened something inside Eli, a crack in the wall that had held his grief and bitterness for too long. By midday, Lucas turned the crank slowly, and the gears groaned like an old animal waking from sleep. The first rotation was hesitant, uneven, but then the blades began to spin, slow and sure, creaking against the wind. A low rush followed, a gurgle deep underground, then the sound of water spilling into the trough below. Dusty let out a holler. "Well, I'll be damned." "It's alive!" Eli stepped closer, watching the clear water pour out, darkening the red soil. For a moment, all he could do was stare. He'd forgotten what that sound felt like, the steady rhythm of life returning to the land. Lucas leaned against the post, breathing heavily. "There," he said, voice low. "Work of hands." Eli looked at him, then nodded. "And heart," he added quietly. The guards nearby clapped, even one of them letting out a short whistle of approval. The other prisoners smiled, pride shining through their weariness. It was more than a job completed. It was proof that something broken could still be mended. As dusk painted the sky in streaks of red and gold, Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carving. It was the shape of a bird again, this one smoother, wings spread as if ready to take flight. He placed it on the base of the windmill without a word. Eli watched him walk back toward the camp, the wind catching the hem of his shirt. He didn't call out, didn't thank him, but deep inside a quiet understanding had taken root. The windmill turned steadily behind him, the water flowing like memory reclaimed, and for the first time in a long while, Eli McGraw didn't feel alone on his land. The first chill of autumn crept into the Texas air, sharp enough to make the mornings feel strange after months of heat. The windmill groaned steadily now, blades cutting the wind like the ticking of a clock that refused to stop. Life around the ranch had found a rhythm again, quiet, humble, and almost peaceful, but peace rarely lasted long in wartime. It was late afternoon when Captain Harris arrived in his jeep, dust spiraling in his wake. Eli McGraw spotted the military vehicle from the fence line and felt a dull weight settle in his chest. Soldiers never came out here unless they carried news, and news during war was rarely good. Harris climbed out, his boots crunching the dry ground. "McGraw," he greeted curtly, tipping his hat. "Need a word with you." Eli nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's Washington got to say this time?" The captain's tone was flat, businesslike. "Orders came through this morning. The POW camp's being relocated. All German prisoners are to be transferred north to Kansas within the week." Eli froze, the rag still in his hand. "All of them?" "Every last one," Harris confirmed. "Transportation starts in 5 days. Your ranch detail will end tomorrow." The wind carried a dry rattle through the mesquite trees. Eli looked toward the camp, where Lucas and the others were hauling feed under the fading light. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Harris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't like it either, but the war's changing. Command wants the camps consolidated, less cost, less travel for the guards." He hesitated before adding, "You've done good work with them, McGraw." Most ranchers wouldn't have. Eli didn't answer. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. That evening, the men at the camp seemed to sense something was wrong. The air was tense, the laughter from past nights gone. Lucas noticed Eli's silence immediately when he brought over the tool ledger. "Something happened," he said. Eli's throat felt tight. "Orders from Washington. You're all being moved north." Lucas blinked slowly, the meaning sinking in. "Moved," he repeated. "How far?" "Kansas," Eli said. "They'll start loading you up in a few days." The German set the ledger down carefully. "And after Kansas?" Eli shook his head. "I don't know." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The windmill turned behind them, its steady rhythm mocking the silence. Finally, Lucas said softly, "Then we have only a few days left." Eli forced a small smile. "Guess so." The next morning, the news spread through the camp like wildfire. The prisoners worked slower, their movements deliberate, as if every strike of a hammer, every lifted board, might hold back the inevitable. The guards grew restless, muttering about schedules and transport lists. Dusty found Eli near the barn. "You going to say goodbye?" he asked. Eli adjusted his hat, eyes on the camp. "Don't see what good it'd do. War's got its own clock, doesn't stop for goodbyes." Dusty shook his head. "Sometimes it should." That night, the wind carried the faint hum of German voices from across the field, low, almost mournful. Eli sat on his porch, coffee cooling in his hand, listening. He didn't know what words to offer, what peace to give, but he knew the next few days would weigh on him long after the war itself was over. The final night came sooner than anyone expected. The air held that uneasy stillness that settles before a farewell, the kind that makes even the wind move softly, as if not to disturb what must end. The guards had loosened their watch, understanding there was nowhere to run and nothing left to win. The prisoners had finished their last day of work at the ranch, leaving behind the repaired fences, the clean troughs, and the spinning windmill that whispered through the dusk. Eli McGraw stood by the gate, hat in hand, staring toward the camp where a small fire burned low. It glowed faintly against the vast dark, a circle of warmth in a world that had grown colder. He hesitated for a long time before walking toward it. Lucas Schneider looked up as Eli approached, his expression calm but distant. "I thought you wouldn't come," Lucas said quietly. Eli shrugged. Wasn't planning to. But the night felt too quiet. Lucas nodded, pouring coffee from a dented kettle into 2 tin cups. "It's not Texas coffee," he said, handing one over, "but it's strong enough to remember." Eli took it, the metal hot against his palms. "You've learned our ways too well." "And you've learned ours," Lucas replied. "To sit, to talk, even when the world says not to." For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, its light flickering across their faces. Around them, a few prisoners sat quietly, murmuring in German, songs, maybe prayers. The war still raged far beyond the plains, but here, for a few hours, it felt like something else entirely. Men remembering they were human. Eli broke the silence first. "When this started, I hated you," he said, his voice low but steady. "Not you, maybe, but what you stood for. My brother died fighting your kind." Lucas stared into the fire. "I know. And mine died following orders I no longer believed in." Eli looked at him, the bitterness in his chest fading into something that almost felt like sorrow. "You ever wonder what it'd be like if the world didn't keep teaching men to hate?" "All the time," Lucas said. "But maybe hate is a teacher that runs out of lessons if we stop listening." Eli gave a small, weary laugh. "You talk like a preacher." "Maybe I am," Lucas said softly, "preaching to save myself." The wind picked up, scattering sparks into the night. Eli sipped the coffee. It was bitter, strong, grounding. "Guess you'll be gone by sunrise," he murmured. "Yes," Lucas said. "They'll take us north." "New place, same fences." Eli looked at the firelight dancing in Lucas's eyes. "You built something good here. Fixed more than you know." Lucas's reply came after a long pause. "So did you." They sat until the fire burned low, the conversation fading into quiet understanding. When Lucas finally stood, he extended his hand. Eli hesitated, then took it. The grip was firm, sincere. 2 men caught between war and peace, each holding the proof that decency could survive both. "Take care of the windmill," Lucas said, voice barely above the wind. "I will," Eli answered. "And the coffee." When he walked back toward the ranch, the fire still glowed behind him, a small defiance against the darkness. He didn't look back, but he carried its warmth with him all the same. Dawn arrived pale and silent, stretching over the Texas plains with a cold light that felt nothing like the mornings Eli McGraw had known all his life. The air was still, heavy with that kind of quiet that makes even the birds hesitate to sing. The rumble of engines came first, a deep, distant thunder rolling toward the camp. Eli stood near the windmill, hat pulled low, watching the dust clouds rise from the convoy of army trucks. They looked almost ghostly through the haze. The guards barked orders, their voices clipped and sharp, but beneath them ran an unspoken tension, a kind of mourning no one wanted to name. Dusty Malone joined him, eyes squinting against the light. "Well," he said softly, "guess it's goodbye time." Eli nodded but said nothing. He watched as the Germans gathered their few belongings, small satchels, folded blankets, bits of wood or metal they'd kept as keepsakes from months of labor. Lucas Schneider was among them, standing straight, his face calm but unreadable. Captain Harris checked his clipboard, calling out names with mechanical precision. "Schneider, Lucas," he said, and Lucas stepped forward. His boots crunched over the dry soil, every step measured. Eli walked closer, stopping just beyond the fence line. For a moment, neither man spoke. The windmill turned lazily behind them, its blades cutting the morning air. "So," Lucas said finally, "it ends here." Eli shook his head slightly. "Nothing that matters ever really ends." Lucas gave a faint smile. "Maybe not, but it changes." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn soft. "For you," he said. Eli hesitated before taking it. "What's this?" "A letter," Lucas said. "Not about war, about work, about peace, about men who shared coffee instead of bullets." Eli's throat tightened. He looked down at the letter, then back up. "You sure you ain't the preacher you said you weren't?" Lucas chuckled quietly. "If I were, I'd tell you to keep building. Fences, windmills, maybe bridges too." A soldier called his name again, impatience in his tone. Lucas adjusted his pack. "Take care of your land, Eli McGraw. It listens to you." Eli nodded. "And you take care of yourself wherever that train takes you." Their hands met once more, rough, firm, honest. For a heartbeat, there were no sides, no uniforms, just two men standing on the same ground, bound by something that neither war nor distance could erase. Lucas turned and climbed into the truck. The engines roared to life, and the convoy began to move, a long line of dust and memory stretching across the open plains. Eli stood still until the last truck disappeared over the rise. Only the faint echo of its motor lingered, swallowed by the wind. Dusty walked up beside him. "He left you something besides that paper," he said quietly. Eli frowned. "What you mean?" Dusty pointed toward the windmill. Tied to its wooden base was the small carved bird Lucas had made, wings outstretched facing north. Eli picked it up, the wood warm from the sun. He turned it over in his hands, then looked toward the horizon where the dust had settled. "Guess some things fly farther than they ought to," he murmured. The wind stirred again, spinning the blades above him. Water trickled from the trough, steady and clear. And beneath that sound, Eli thought he heard something else, the echo of laughter carried by the wind, fading, but never gone. The days after the departure passed in a blur of silence. The land felt larger now, emptier, as though the wind itself carried the memory of footsteps that no longer pressed into the dust. The fences held firm, the cattle grazed, and the windmill spun faithfully in the afternoon sun. But everything seemed to echo, each sound returning to Eli McGraw twice as loud and half as warm. He rose early, as he always had, but the mornings no longer came with conversation or the low hum of German voices working across the pasture. The air was still. Even Dusty had gone north for a time to help his cousin's ranch, leaving Eli alone with the rhythm of chores and the dull ache of routine. The letter Lucas had left sat on the kitchen table, unfolded and creased from being read too many times. Eli had memorized every line. "There is peace in labor," it began, "because hands remember what hearts forget." The rest spoke of hope, of rebuilding, of how men were meant to plant more than they tore down. Eli had laughed at the poetry the first time, but now he wasn't sure if it was foolish or wise. Maybe both. He spent his afternoons near the windmill, tightening bolts that didn't need tightening, checking the water flow just to hear the gurgle break the silence. The carved wooden bird still hung from its post, wings open to the north. Sometimes he swore the grain of the wood had darkened, weathered by sun and time, like it was alive and waiting. Neighbors came and went, offering polite conversation and glances full of things left unsaid. Some still disapproved, though they spoke of it less now. The war had dragged on and folks were tired, too tired to argue about men who'd long since been taken away. One evening, as the sky burned red across the horizon, Eli sat on the porch with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The sun dipped low, throwing long shadows that reached all the way to the edge of the pasture. For a moment, he could almost see them again, Lucas and the others, shoulders bent under the weight of work, their laughter threading through the dry air. He blinked, and the illusion faded, leaving only the hum of crickets and the creak of wood settling in the heat. He took a slow sip of the coffee and muttered, Guess it's just you and me now, Tom. He looked toward the mantel inside the house, where his brother's photograph rested beside the carved bird. You'd have liked him, he added after a pause. Didn't say much, but when he did, it mattered. The night deepened. Stars began to prick the sky, countless and cold. Eli leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. Somewhere, far off, a train whistle sounded, a lonely, lingering note cutting through the dark. He wondered if Lucas could hear the same whistle wherever he was. Maybe he was looking at the same stretch of sky, thinking of the same wind that carried dust and stories across a country too big for hate to fill. Eli finished his coffee, the last sip bitter at the bottom of the cup. Tomorrow would come the same as always, sun, sweat, silence. But for the first time, that silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Months rolled by, each one marked by the slow patience of the land. Winter came mild and dry, then gave way to a spring that promised rain, but rarely kept its word. Eli McGraw worked the ranch alone, his movements steady, deliberate, shaped by habit and silence. Yet something within him had shifted. His anger had burned out like a fire that finally ran out of wood. Then one morning clouds gathered thick over the horizon, heavy and grey, the kind that meant real rain this time. The air smelled different, clean, electric, alive. Eli stood by the fence line, hat tilted against the wind as the first drops fell. They started soft, hesitant, before turning into a downpour that washed months of dust from the earth. He didn't move. He let it soak through his shirt and run down his face like some kind of baptism he hadn't asked for, but needed all the same. By afternoon, the ground had turned slick and the troughs overflowed. The windmill spun faster than it had in months, creaking with the rhythm of revival. Water surged from the pipe below, filling the barrels and feeding the soil that had long forgotten how to drink. Eli watched it flow and felt a quiet satisfaction stir in his chest. When Dusty Malone rode up later that day, mud splattered to his knees, he let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. The old place looks alive again. Eli smiled faintly. Didn't think I'd live to see the earth remember it could breathe. Dusty dismounted, glancing at the spinning windmill. Looks like that thing's got a second life. Yeah, Eli said softly. Guess we all do. They stood in the rain for a while, neither man feeling the need to fill the space with words. The wind howled through the open plains, and Eli felt something deep inside him loosen, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since the day his brother left for Europe. When the rain finally eased, the world smelled of mesquite and wet clay. Eli walked back toward the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. Inside, he poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table beside the carved bird. Its wooden wings seemed to gleam under the lamplight, the grain darker now from the months of weathering. Dusty leaned against the doorway. Can you ever think about what comes next? Eli took a slow sip. Used to think there wasn't much left, but now, maybe I'll teach the young hands how to work proper. Maybe tell them about the war, but not the fighting part, the part where men remember their men. Dusty nodded. You mean the campfire and coffee part? Eli smiled. Yeah. That part. Outside, the last drops fell from the eaves, tapping against the metal bucket below. The air was cool, the kind that made the skin wake up. He looked out across the land, his land, and felt something rare bloom inside him. Peace, plain and unadorned. The windmill turned steady, blades slicing through the wind like a heartbeat. Eli thought of Lucas, somewhere far north, maybe standing under the same rain. And for the first time the thought didn't ache. It simply belonged, like the wind, like the land, like the work of hands that never truly stopped. Years passed, and the war faded into memory, its echoes softened by time and distance. The ranch endured as it always had, bending with the wind but never breaking. The windmill still stood tall, its blades turning slow and sure, the same steady rhythm that had carried Eli McGraw through the hardest seasons of his life. Eli had grown older, his hair white now, his hands rough but sure. The work had slowed, but the fire in him hadn't gone out. He'd taken on a few young ranch hands, teaching them the same lessons Lucas once had helped remind him of. Patience, pride in labor, respect for the land. They listened when he spoke, not just because he was the boss, but because his words carried the weight of something lived. One quiet afternoon, a stranger arrived at the ranch. A young man in his 20s, polite but unsure, carrying a small leather satchel and a letter in his hand. Eli met him by the porch, squinting under the brim of his hat. "You're Mr. McGraw?" the young man asked, his English touched by a faint German rhythm. Eli nodded slowly. "That's right, you lost?" The young man shook his head. "No, sir. I came from Hamburg." "My name is Karl Schneider." The name hung between them like a held breath. Eli's heart gave a slow, startled thud. "Schneider?" he repeated, his voice softer now. Karl nodded. "My father was Lucas Schneider. He passed 3 years ago. Before he died, he told me stories about a ranch in Texas, a man named Eli, and coffee shared by the fire. He asked that if I ever made it here, I should find you." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred the dry grass, and Eli felt the years collapse into one another. The camp, the laughter, the firelight flickering on faces half forgotten, but never lost. "Well," Eli finally said, clearing his throat, "if you came looking for coffee, you came to the right place." Karl smiled, a familiar warmth in his eyes that hit Eli straight in the chest. They sat on the porch, 2 generations joined by memory. Eli poured the coffee, the same dented pot still doing its duty after all these years. Karl listened quietly as Eli spoke of those months during the war, how men worked side by side despite everything they'd been told, how a windmill had turned again because one man believed it could. When Eli finished, Karl reached into his satchel and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was another carving, a bird, wings outstretched, finer than the one Lucas had left behind. "He made this before he died," Karl said softly, "said it was meant to fly farther than he ever could." Eli turned the carving over in his calloused hands. "Your father had a gift for making things live longer than they should." Karl smiled. "He said you did too." The sun dipped low, the sky streaked gold and violet. Eli felt the ache of years ease just a little. "You tell your old man," he said quietly. He kept his promise. The story made it home. Karl looked out toward the spinning windmill, the bird resting between them. "Maybe it never needed a home," he said. "Maybe it just needed to keep moving." Eli nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Like the wind, he looked toward the horizon, where the last light met the open land. "And if this story found you," he said softly, "don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel and keep it alive, because some stories deserve to keep traveling."